Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's the last session of the day. Snack table is out. There's sunshine, so we appreciate you being here. It's actually pretty good attendance for last session of the day. My name is Catherine McAlvage. I'm one of the assistant directors of course development and training at eCampus. And I'm actually on this panel. We lost our moderator last minute because colds are going around eCampus, like I'm sure they are in your departments too. So I'm going to get us started today. I also just want to quickly introduce my co-presenters who have been wonderful collaborators on this presentation and on an issue that continues to be of interest to faculty and to those of us at eCampus and other units. And so my co-presenters today are Elizabeth McBrien, and Elizabeth is one of our instructional design specialists at eCampus. And also Willie Morgan has joined us. He's the Assistant Director of Operations for Student Conduct and Community Standards. So together we're going to tackle what's kind of a big issue and always has been to some extent in higher education, but we're going to take a little bit of a new slant on it to talk about academic integrity in this new kind of world that is being termed the cheating economy. And I'll talk a little bit more in just a minute about what that means. We will go through about half an hour's worth of presentation content, and we should have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. And we would invite your questions at the end of our presentation, so please do note those as we go. We'll be happy to just open it up to conversation at the end too, so that we can think about this together. Okay, so that being said, the place we always want to begin when we talk about academic integrity is to call out that this is not a problem specific to the online modality. In fact, students struggle in all modalities, in face-to-face, in hybrid, and in online. Contextually, we're also talking about a range of interpretations about intellectual property, and this is increasingly true as our student population diversifies. We know that student interpretations vary with age, culture, and other factors. For example, millennials have a different relationship to intellectual property because they have grown up in an age when media has been freely shared on the internet, often without any respect to copyright law. Additionally, many non-Western cultures hold knowledge in common in ways that are diametrically opposed to our individualistic notions of intellectual property. So if you happen to be teaching a diverse student group, or if your students are diversifying, there may not be a shared interpretation of appropriate source use until you create one. Let's also just acknowledge up front that only a small percentage of students struggle with integrity issues such that they're really truly intending to cheat, okay? Many students commit plagiarism or other acts of dishonesty out of confusion, lack of time, lots of things going on in their life, or lack of attention to detail, or some combination of those factors. So what we're really here to think about more today is this so-called cheating economy and how we can collectively respond. What this term cheating economy primarily refers to is a network of websites that lure good students into sharing content that they shouldn't. These websites usually misrepresent themselves as tutoring services, making appeals to well-meaning students that want to help out their classmates and perhaps get paid to do that, what looks to be on the surface, good work. Okay, the websites involved in the cheating economy often have some sort of study or notes site description. And here students can share study guides and test questions to help each other out. The luring of good students may begin on a volunteer basis, but often works up to websites paying students to share more and more content, or over time, higher stakes content, like quiz and exam questions. Of course, at the far end of the spectrum, we might also include contract cheating. This is another term that's being used a lot in this conversation, which is where students hire someone to write an essay or more on their behalf. And again, I'll just say this over and over, I think we all will throughout the presentation today, that all of these facets of the cheating economy can affect online courses just as much as any face-to-face or hybrid course. So here I just want to call your attention to the fact that academic integrity violations can vary quite widely. We, as in our presentation today, are primarily talking about instances that fall in one of those first two columns, the one on the left-hand side and the one in the middle. Other institutions have discovered cases of students hiring out for a partial or a full course. As far as we know, maybe Willie can clarify for us, we don't know of an instance of that happening at OSU. Throughout the presentation, it may be helpful to think back to this spectrum as we always want to think about consequences that are proportionate. So thinking here that sometimes academic integrity violations are pretty minor and might require more of an educational response, and sometimes heightened consequences are more appropriate. Another point I just want to make here too, just a moment of self-reflection, is you might want to be thinking as we go today about what tools or strategies your department or discipline or that we offer in eCampus can help to respond to various points on the spectrum. What do these responses look like on our behalf? I'll move soon to some strategies and tools, and then you'll also have an opportunity throughout today to think about which ones are best for your courses in terms of fit. Okay, so in thinking about this issue of the cheating economy that comes up more and more all the time, especially as we're having cross-institutional discussions about academic integrity, we have a wonderful team of student workers in CDT, and we set them to do a little bit of detective work for us in the fall. So bear in mind, this was in the fall. We haven't done an updated study, but I want to give you a little bit of insight into what we found. We pulled a sample of 50 back core courses at OSU, all modalities, so not just eCampus classes, but some that are taught in all three modalities, hybrid, face-to-face, and online. And here's what we found. The content that exists out there, it's a little more than we thought it might be. About 36 of those 50 courses had content that exists out online that students could grab. This content ranges from notes and flashcards, and in many cases, very legitimate student postings of sharing their notes with students from lecture, or creating, for example, Quizlets to help themselves practice for quizzes or exams, nothing that actually had to do with the real exam content. We did find some real quiz and exam content out there, as well as instructor lectures, other ancillary course resources, etc. So there's quite a bit of material out there. I've listed here, and remember that this will be shared with you, so you're welcome to go poke around in these sites. Some of the top hits just in this sample of the 50 back core courses were Quizlet and Course Hero, and a site called Koofers, which is a little bit newer. We had kind of a category of lesser hits where there is some content out there, but not quite as much. And then Chegg is notoriously hard to kind of dig around in unless you start posting or paying for things. But we know that that's very often a source of like the instructor guide to your textbook that might have all the quiz answers, for example. If you don't mind, I think we will hold questions till the end just to make sure we don't run out of time. But please note your questions. We will circle back to them. So we would encourage you, this is an invitation to all of you, and perhaps you would take this back to your departments and share with your colleagues, might be worth doing a little bit of searching on your own. Or if you have a TA or GTA that you might want to set to work on this, poke around, see what you can find. I think one of our responses is, ooh, this is exactly why we would encourage you to come back and redevelop a course with eCampus, or at the very least, and I'm going to reiterate this a couple of times today too, we have support. It's actually on my team to help you refresh quiz and exam content. And we can do that regularly and outside of the context of formal course redevelopment, okay? So if you find that that's an issue, specifically around quizzes and exams, let us know. We can help you stay on top of those things. Also, I didn't put this in the slide because there wasn't really a pretty way to do this, but the other faculty response might be to take a peek into the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. One of the responses you can do is, as a faculty member, submit a takedown notice to one of these sites and try to get that content pulled off. That may or may not be the best response, right? Because then we're kind of playing a cat and mouse game of, can we always keep on top of where the content exists? And as I'm sure Willie and his team could tell us, as soon as students find out that we're going after one site, they'll find another, right? So that's not always the best response, but we do want you to have that information. And I have a pretty good link in there that will give you an overview of what the takedown process looks like and some steps you could take if you're interested in pursuing a takedown notice. Okay, so in terms of eCampus and how we're thinking about it, we want you to know that we're involved. Shannon specifically is involved with a couple of professional organizations in cross-institutional discussions and working groups, and we talk about these things at conferences, because really this is going to be a cross-institutional effort, ultimately, that we need to work on this together. And we want to be at the forefront of thinking about proactive approaches to protect the integrity of the education we offer, while balancing concerns with academic integrity with things like faculty time and how much do you spend trying to ensure academic integrity or doing the kinds of assignments that require a lot of instructor feedback because those lend themselves more toward academic integrity and it's harder to cheat. So there are 4 categories of what we're calling proactive rather than reactive steps that we can take to our eCampus courses to support and forward academic integrity. And I'll start in on a couple of them and then Elizabeth will pick up the remaining ones. So the first is advocating for good course design, specifically for staged assignments or assignments that have multiple stages with built-in feedback loops, because we know that it's harder for students to cheat on these. It helps to protect academic integrity. It also means that students are better supported throughout the process, so there might be fewer opportunities for students to have that impulse of, oh, I have such high anxiety, or I'm out of time, or I just don't understand, which open the doors for them to go find another source that might not be a good one and to ultimately commit an academic integrity violation. As you may know, OSU has an institution-wide subscription to Turnitin. That's our plagiarism detection tool. And it is a good practice oftentimes to simply enable the Turnitin check on any paper that you have students submit. If you want to avoid playing plagiarism police, another thing I've used in my own online writing classes that's been really helpful to talk about academic integrity as an educational issue instead of making me the plagiarism police, is to set it up as a draft. So allow students to submit their paper to Turnitin, see the report, and have an opportunity to make changes before they ultimately submit a copy that I'm going to see. And students really appreciate that because citation is really hard. And so if your course is one in which the academic integrity violations are around citation, I would highly recommend that. Just remember, Turnitin is not foolproof. It does not replace your eyes as the professor to look through things and see if something's a little off, right? See if there's really odd words used, see if this looks totally different than an earlier version of the paper, those kinds of things. Other design choices that support academic integrity are alternative, authentic assessments, original course content that you create collaboratively with us at eCampus, and not necessarily publisher content. And as I've mentioned before, refreshed or very large, diversified quiz question banks. We can help you, as I've said before, with refreshing question banks at any time. So that can be low-hanging fruit, is if you build the questions and bring them to us, or basically write them out in a Word document, we can build them for you. Modeling for your students is really critical too. Students need to see good practice around citation in action. Images are a particularly sticky point, as images outside of the public domain or Creative Commons licensing should go through documented fair use processes. It's so easy to grab an image off of Google, but we want to avoid doing that. We also want to make sure that all sources in our eCampus courses are cited, especially if you've added things since an instructional designer has helped you to develop. And it's good to do these citations in the style that your students might be asked to use in your course. Again, modeling, right? And then if your course uses social media with students, there is a hashtag for conversations about academic integrity, which is #ExcelWithIntegrity. And if you're on Twitter, this is also just a fun conversation to poke into because there's lots of institutions using this. So you can kind of see what people are talking about. Simply having integrity on the minds of students helps them to make choices that avoid violations. A lot of students have been exposed to citation as something they were simply told to do without understanding the reasoning behind it. And that said, you have an opportunity to bring your students into the professional standards of your discipline by having conversations, and ideally not just one, but many, and reminders too, about integrity. And that's another thing that you can do. Okay, I'm going to pass it off to Elizabeth. She's going to pick it up from here.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Hi, everyone. So I'd like to talk a little bit about advocating, modeling, educating, and holding accountable, and then also do an exercise that can give you some kind of practical tips about how to handle this kind of violation if you suspect one. So has anybody here ever tried having students sign an integrity pledge in your course? Okay, yeah, I know the College of Business does that sometimes, and there are a few ways to do that. You can have them It can be part of your assignment or your assessment, or it could be a Canvas quiz tool that is built into your course, maybe at the beginning, to have this on the minds of students. And so kind of going back to our keynote speaker today, actually, Michelle Pacansky-Brock, she mentioned empathy and the role of empathy in supporting our students and extending that empathy to kind of help, reduce dropout rates and things like that. So I want to encourage faculty to have, give the students the benefit of the doubt. And so when we think we've found a violation, when we suspect academic misconduct, there's a process that we can follow, a specific process that Willie's going to talk about in detail. But I want to do an exercise here that gets you thinking about how you can approach this with empathy and also in a supportive way for yourself. So this is a think, pair, share activity. So let's go on this little situation here, this little adventure. So first, I'd like you to turn to a partner and talk about this. Let me explain the situation. So as you approach a store, maybe you're going to Trader Joe's or something like that in town, you notice that there's an infant left in a baby carriage, left outside the store. No caregiver in sight. What goes through your mind? How do you feel about seeing this? And would you tell someone? Would you call someone? Would you tell someone in the store? So think about how you feel and think about, try to guess, maybe interpret what the caregiver was thinking by leaving their child outside the store. So I'll give you just a couple of minutes to talk with a partner. Okay? Okay, everyone. Hello. Okay, so I'd like to have you share just a little bit so we can keep going here. But did anybody have any, if you grew up in America, if you see this kind of thing outside a store, it might be upsetting. Did anybody have any kinds of feelings that might have been upsetting seeing this, or some fear for the child? Just raise your hand. Okay. So so the reason that I gave this example is because when you find a suspected academic misconduct, if you're a faculty member, it can be upsetting. And of course, having it be reported can be even more upsetting for the student. But when you're a faculty member and you see, maybe you've done great design, maybe you've had staged assignments, and then it's the final exam and the student has turned in a paper that is totally different than, some assignments you've had earlier, it can feel, you can feel pretty upset. So let me talk about this situation, what this means. So this is an activity that's from Stell's Ting Tommy's Describe, Interpret, Evaluate process. Is anybody familiar with that?
Well, no, but we've been to Iceland and we've seen
Yeah,
it.
okay. All right, great.
The first time you see it.
Exactly, thank you. Yeah, I was hoping somebody in the audience would be from Iceland or familiar with this situation. So you nailed it. Yeah, so this is something that happens in Iceland. And this was a picture that I took in Iceland because I had heard about this. And then I was like, no way, that can't be true. But it is. And so, so from an Icelandic perspective, I have a couple of quotes here from an Icelandic parent. Katrín Friedrichsdóttir says that Icelandic people are pretty obsessed about having their kids sleep outside. That's the only way to do it. And then when she moved to Seattle in 2008, she left her 9-month-old outside a cafe in the middle of winter, and she said, even the hippies didn't like it. She said, one man came and scolded me, saying, this isn't safe. This isn't what good mothers do. And so I wanted to show you this because even when we feel like, oh, we know the answer here, we know this is good or we know this is bad, someone like our student might have a different perspective, and they might have some really good reasons behind why they did something. And so it's important to go through the process that we have at OSU to document academic misconduct because it gives students a chance to show their side. So with the man that scolded the woman from Iceland who left her baby outside, he jumped right to the judgment stage, the evaluation, this is not what good mothers do. So if he had stayed in the describe side of things and said, I noticed your infant was outside, and then the interpretation side, I feel afraid that something might happen to it, then that would slow things down and give a chance for her to maybe explain a little bit about her culture, that kind of thing. So, so let's apply this process to a scenario. Let's say it's week 11, and you have this essay that you think is plagiarized. So what can you do as a faculty member? So I encourage you to pause, and instead of jumping right to, oh, this is cheating, how did this happen, oh no, try to pause and just put your feelings and judgments on hold and observe evidence, and then describe the evidence and facts if you feel like this is something that needs to be reported. So that would look like this. So the sentence in this essay is not quoted and is exactly the same as the one in this online magazine. The source is not cited. So then with the OSU process that Willie's going to talk about, there is a place for faculty members to make a recommendation. So you can say, I would like the student to receive a penalty here, or something else. Perhaps maybe they just need some education about this topic. Okay, so so from our perspective, we believe that the educational environment should be a safe place for students to make honest mistakes and learn from them. At the same time, it's also a place where students are held accountable for their misconduct, whether the violation was made intentionally or unwittingly. And so that kind of goes back to this idea of empathy and how we strike that balance. So empathy comes with how we respond to students and how we talk to them and support them. So we give them emotional support with empathy. We think about their inexperience. So like Catherine mentioned, students who are coming in right now, especially the youngest ones, the kind of iGen students, they really have grown up with this seemingly open internet. And so they might be quite inexperienced with this kind of idea of intellectual property. So have empathy for that, and also their varying cultural backgrounds and perspectives and things like that. But it is important to hold students accountable for their behavior, and that's the documentation part and education part about expectations. Okay, so we'd like to just have you think about reframing your perspective from how do we stop students from cheating to how do we ensure students are learning. That's another way that can be helpful when we're talking about this topic. And I'd like to just invite Willie up to talk more about this. We'll just skip ahead here. Okay.
So I'm Willie. I work in the Office of Student Conduct, and I've been in my role for 5 years. And so in that time, we've done a lot of things with our policy and our procedures, and I've learned a lot about academic misconduct and some of the things that our students try to do or some students accidentally do on their way to try to get a degree here. And so The questions I get from colleges a lot is, what do I do when I see it? What if the student didn't mean to, or do I have alternatives to reporting? In general, the advice I give is that when you observe it happening, go ahead and collect and evaluate all relevant information. So that's your observations, that's the work that they turned in, that's anything else that you can find related to it that makes you suspect it to be academic misconduct. And then identify why you think it's academic misconduct, and then submit an academic misconduct report. Know that, I'll go through this momentarily, the students are going to have an opportunity to defend their action, explain the situation, give context to it, to help ensure that the outcome of that process is generally fair, even if the outcome isn't exactly what they want, or that there's negative feelings towards that. And really the line drawn in the dirt is if you are applying an academic penalty because you think it's academic misconduct, that's when the need to report's there, because we have to give the student a fair process, both out of interest for them, but also protecting us from being accused of bias or going outside the process and opening ourselves up to risk by not doing it fairly. Know that the code doesn't pay attention to whether the student intended to do it or didn't intend to do it. We don't necessarily look at any of those character judgments on a student. We're simply trying to address the action, and we need to address the action whether it's purposeful or not purposeful, and we try to engage the student to figure that out and help us move forward. Our process doesn't assume responsibility until it's substantiated through the process, meaning if you make a report that you're not even 100% sure on, or not even 50% sure on, it'll be given thorough review, and if the student's found not responsible or the college hearing officer doesn't allege a violation, just because that was reported doesn't have any negative effects on the student, just so you know. And then we also don't need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And so we use a preponderance of the evidence standards, which means what more likely than not occurred based on the evidence submitted to us. And so I know that's one of those things that will hold a person who observes academic misconduct for a second and make them think, oh, well, I don't know for sure. If that's the case, but you have evidence, put that forward and give the student an opportunity to speak to that evidence and to that observation. A lot of times students come in and they are able to provide evidence to the contrary and explain how it happened in a way that didn't violate the code. And often students will come in and say, yeah, I did it. These are the reasons behind it. And we're able to go through the process in a fair way. So know that even though we don't, you just don't have to be 100% sure. We want to work on your best assessment of the situation and initiate the process. The process that the university has is designed to provide due process to the student. That includes consistent notice of what the allegation is. We give the student an opportunity to review and respond to the allegation and to utilize an advisor in the process, so they're not doing it on their own. The process provides an independent review by a college hearing officer to take away any perceptions of bias or power dynamics by the person ultimately making the decision as to if they're responsible for academic misconduct. Hopefully that reduces the burden and risk for instructors, so that when you do observe it week 11, but you have a big stack of other assignments you need to grade, you're able to put that into context, put it in a report, and then get back to your grading of other things. Or if it's happening in midterm, get back to just teaching your class and moving along and reaching your outcomes. Through our process, we have increased the consistency in the appeal processes, and that we have one major appeal for the students. And really, once we get them going through the academic misconduct process, we really have the opportunity at that point to get the students the education that they need to prevent the future recurrences. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we move on. But here's kind of the instructor's role in the academic misconduct process. Once you observe and document the academic misconduct information, you're going to confer with the departmental head. The tiny red font here notes that instructors may but are not required to address the alleged behavior with the student. And so you don't have to tell a student that you are reporting them for academic misconduct. because we want to prevent the need for an instructor to basically pre-review the case and before they submit a report. Now, you are welcome to say, hey, I observed this. Try to tell me what went on here. How'd you write this paper, and so forth. You're certainly welcome to do that. You are in relationship with the student, and sometimes that can enhance that conversation, and sometimes that conversation can enhance the relationship. So feel free to do that. But no, if you have 200 students in your class, and that happens on the first assignment of the day, and you're thinking about all those other things you have to do, it's not a requirement for you to review it with the student. So once you are on the same page with your department head that you can submit this, go ahead and submit the academic misconduct report electronically through the student conduct website, and then that will get in the hands of the college hearing officer, who will take it from there as far as proceeding through the steps of review. And really the instructor's role at that point is to wait. And if something's needed, the hearing officer will request more information from you. Otherwise, you'll likely be CC'd or otherwise communicated to about what the outcome is and what the next steps are, how that would impact what grade you put in the grade book. The college hearing officer is going to review all the reports and create the case. They're going to send notice to the student and invite them to meet. Per the process, they allow the students 10 days following their meeting to formalize a response in writing. This gives the student an opportunity to really kind of prepare and think about, and not just be susceptible to need to speak to the allegation 100% when they're first presented with the evidence in that meeting. The college hearing officer will review all information and confer as needed, and then they'll send a decision letter to the student outlining the finding and any sanctions, and that's usually when they'll follow up with the instructor to let you know the outcome. If the student's found responsible, the eligible academic penalties are a penalty on the assignment or exam, the penalty on the course. That could include an F grade for course. The big difference between just a penalty in the course and an F grade for course is if we assign an F grade for course, then that grade is going to stick in their record. They're not able to withdraw and have it show up as a W. They'll actually get an F on their transcript. So that's one of the highest grade penalties that would be assigned. And then colleges have the ability to remove students from the academic college if it's a severe enough or repeated offense. The educational sanctions are also going to be assigned at this point by the hearing officer. And currently we have a Canvas course that engages the student in some information about academic misconduct, the underlying causes of academic misconduct, and resources and methods of avoiding academic misconduct. And then we have a way for them to demonstrate their learning and complete a follow-up meeting with a staff member or volunteer from our office to really engage with them about what they learn, what their understanding is going forward, to really try to hammer home every lesson that they need to have so that they can move forward successfully here at OSU without future recurrences. We soon, really in the summer and moving into fall, are going to open up the sanctioning options for college hearing officers to have a wider menu of sanction options to engage people with different learning styles or learning needs in different efforts to help them create learning out of their situation while learning about what they need to in regards to academic misconduct. The sanctions and learning activities try to meet these outcomes. We invite the student to evaluate the impact of the incident. We assess the student's understanding of university policies. We give students, we guide the students through a learning activity that supports their academic success. We encourage them to develop strategies moving forward to make sure that whatever went wrong in this past incident doesn't happen again. We attend to the student and just what it's like to kind of be going along academically and then get called out on academic misconduct, especially if it's an accidental thing or an unexpected life situation that comes up. We really try to coach them and make the outcome relevant to them, and we do that a lot through the follow-up meetings. And then we just make sure that their process with the course and the academic process itself gets to all the learning outcomes. For instructors, I wanted to let you know that our website, the Student Conduct website, has a faculty landing page that has some information about academic misconduct in particular, where we have our link to our reports, but we also have some information about what the process is if you need to reference it when you're presented with a situation that you may need to report. We have in there some strategies for preventing academic misconduct, and one of the things we have on there is just individual tips for prevent academic misconduct in your course. And we also have in there a link where you can submit ideas or things that you've done that work for you. And so I encourage you, if you are on our website, to consider submitting a tip that's worked for you. And we're going to try to kind of populate that with OSU specific tips and materials. I know I've heard this when I present to colleges of individual instructors standing up and talking about something that they changed about one element of their course that significantly reduced their academic misconduct. And I think sharing that information as widely as possible is going to be useful. I also have some suggested syllabus statement materials in there where the required syllabus statement for academic misconduct is very minimal. It requires you to mention that there's a code of student conduct and provide the link. And I think that what our website addresses is, number one, a sample paragraph, but also all the things that may be specific to your course that you might want to highlight in the syllabus to really start the discussion about what academic misconduct is and why it's important in your course before students are presented with a situation where they need to get something done and they don't know the material or they didn't start early enough, and so that they kind of understand that this is important for the class. This is what this is the black and white around the gray area, and then they can make a better informed decision at that point.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes and we will open it up to questions. I know we had some hands earlier. Yeah. Yep.
Just making sure you're talking to me.
I am.
I had to fill out an academic misconduct report for the first time ever in my academic career just a few days ago, so the timing is really helpful. And I'm curious to see what the outcome is going to be. So this was an incident of plagiarism that was detected by Turnitin,
Mm-hmm.
which I use with all my classes now through Canvas, on eCampus and on campus. And in my report, I filled out that my recommendation was a 0 on the assignment. It was an essay that was worth 15% of the student's grade. So who has the last word, the ultimate decision on whether that penalty gets applied? The Office of Student Misconduct or me as the professor?
Do I have to push this?
Yep. No. You're
okay.
good.
Can people hear me? Okay. So the college hearing officer has the final word if it stays in their hands. What you don't know as an instructor is if this is the student's first incident, second incident, third incident of academic misconduct. In cases of repeated academic misconduct, sometimes that gets forwarded to the Office of Student Conduct and we adjudicate in lieu of or in place of the college hearing officer, because only our office can suspend, expel, or put students on probation for the university. And so in that case, we would have the final word. Outside of those cases, the college hearing officer themselves would have the final word pending appeal. We don't get too many appeals on academic misconduct now, in which case the appeal officer would have some options to alter, change, or reverse the decision of the hearing officer. But the ultimate decision lies with the college hearing officer.
And what if I disagree with it? Is there what kind of conflict here are we talking with academic freedom?
So the academic freedom decision, and that kind of goes back to the other side of your question, is you're the one who's making the change, and so you are responsible for doing that. If you put in a grade that does not reflect the decision that is the outcome of the due process, you're putting yourself in the institution at a certain level of risk to do that. And so if you disagree, that you want to have that conversation with the hearing officer and try to bring resolution of that. We do not have an appeal process for the reporting party. And so that's one thing that came up and was a big point of discussion as we designed the academic integrity process. There was interest in having an appeal for the instructor. In the end, we decided not to provide an appeal for the instructor, and there is a certain level of kind of burden of responsibility for the instructor to present all the information up front that is sufficient for the instructor to make the appropriate finding.
I think that you need to implement a way for instructors to appeal the decision. Otherwise, I think there's a conflict that this compromises academic freedom.
Mm-hmm. So currently, we are not reviewing the process. That will happen sometime in the next couple years. We implemented the current process 2 years ago, so we are due, and we're going to start the conversation this summer and probably finish the conversation next summer about where we want to go with the process. But certainly, when we solicit information, please offer that information. Feel free to offer that information directly to me or your college hearing officer unsolicited, and then we can take that in and hang on to that and have that potentially inform any decisions of changes to the process in the future.
I report a lot of academic integrity in my class that I'm working on. I've made changes that have improved it, and I'm working on more changes. But I remember hearing at some point that you would be able to potentially hold students who posted to those paid-for sites like Course Hero accountable for what they've posted that then gets reused. Is that still happening? I don't remember hearing anything about it.
That one.
Yeah, so you are welcome to report any observations of that, and it will go through the process the same way. Most,
Like patient zero papers, like this is the person.
yeah. Yeah, so we would love to hold those parties accountable. Usually, when we do hold those parties accountable, we do it after we found somebody who used that paper. We start there, and sometimes we trace it back to patient zero. Sometimes instructors just go and they sign on to Course Hero. I invite you to look up one of your courses on Course Hero because there's stuff on there. And you're welcome to submit a report for stuff that's posted. And then it's going to, when we know that it's used by someone else, it's easier for us to make a case for that. But certainly if you make a good case for it, even without having, I don't know who's after patient 0, patient 30. Even if we don't have that, there's obviously something problematic of sharing your material, especially if it's your test material, copyrighted material, and so forth. And we can pursue that through the process. The decision will ultimately come down to the college hearing officer's review.
Oh, we got lots of hands. Let's start with Tim, and then we'll circle back around.
Do you have an account for Chegg so that you can look at what's posted there?
We do not. Well, let me rephrase. So we chose not to do one with Chegg because of how tricky it is to get to the material based on a paid subscription. We do have one with Course Hero right now from our office that we're going to use as needed to develop evidence. I'm guessing by that question, you've looked around for some material online before.
I've seen for my courses, as soon as I publish a new assignment,
Okay.
it doesn't take very long for it to show up on Chegg.
Okay.
Yeah, one that I just posted like the last week of last term, I just searched and I found 3 hits on Chegg for it.
Okay. Do you have a personal account on Chegg? Okay. Because I would love to learn if it's particularly useful to do that, because our office could potentially get a Chegg account to try to help the investigatory process to find the evidence of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, even without that, I mean, you can see that it's using the exact same wording from my assignment
Yeah.
there, but then the solution is hidden behind the paywall.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to clarify something. So at some point, maybe not as recently as I imagined, the language on the academic misconduct website was that instructors have some choice in whether they report or not. Is that no longer the case?
So I guess the part that I didn't emphasize as I went through that is you do have you're the one who's immediately reviewing it and make a determination if it's even suspected academic misconduct. That's one of your points of choice. If you are not identifying it as academic misconduct, but you are identifying it as something else. So let's say you require, you have a 15% of your assignments need to have proper grammar and citations, and you think somebody made a mistake that warrants a deduction of that 15%, but doesn't necessarily constitute this person, tried to use someone else's words and so forth. We think they just made a mistake. That's really where the instructor's purview can be used and so forth. If you're making a judgment that this is academic misconduct, so I can't give them points, that a student deserves due process for that, and so that's when you would be reporting.
Okay, so if I'm like, I have language in the syllabus that's like you get a 0 for plagiarism, and then I'm like, whoops, that's plagiarism, you get a 0. Now I'm obligated to report it?
So you would want to send that through the system, submit your syllabus along with the evidence, put in your recommendation that you recommend a 0 on the assignment, citing your own syllabus, and that should be sufficient for the instructor to make a good decision, the college hearing officer. The college hearing officer will definitely take into account the instructor recommendation, but what they do is they kind of check for consistency and fairness across the college. So if, say, one section is applying a 0 for the assignment for anything, and another class section is doing 50% off the assignment, they're going to try to equalize that. They don't have an obligation to equalize it, and most college hearing officers have kind of developed their own practices and policies to enforce that, to enforce an equitable outcome for those, but it is definitely per college and per hearing officer.